It's no exaggeration to say that the automobile has revolutionized our society. I drove here this morning from Washington, D.C., and I imagine many of you drove here from other places. And as we drove, we traveled over a landscape that's been transformed by the automobile. It's changed our cities, our towns, and our rural areas. It's affected our industries and jobs, creating new jobs and new industries in things like gas stations and auto repair and batteries and car insurance. And it's shaped our culture. The automobile is a literal vehicle for the American values of freedom and self-expression. But looking back over a little under 100 years ago, when the automobile first came onto the scene, no one, not even the people in the industry, could foresee what changes were down the road. So back in around 1900, the predecessor of the German car company Daimler commissioned a survey to look at what they thought could be an estimate of worldwide demand for automobiles. And the figure that they came up with was that there will be about 1 million cars sold worldwide. Now, why did they come up with this figure? Well, it was because they estimated that there were only about 1 million people available to be trained as chauffeurs. So think of it. About 100 years ago, car companies didn't think we'd drive our own cars. And coming up pretty soon, they may be right. So earlier this year, I got the opportunity to have my first ride in an autonomous vehicle. And it was very exciting for me to see the technology. But one of the things that it brought to mind was the experience of my mother, Hannah, who in her entire life has had a serious vision problem and has never been able to drive. So she always had to have someone else drive her to the store or to see friends or to see family. And I thought about how this autonomous vehicle could revolutionize the lives of other disabled people and allow them more measure of independence and autonomy. Now, there are other great promises of societal benefit from these vehicles. First thing that it could do is save us time or give us back, make some of our time more useful. So think about finishing that last-minute project on your way to the office, or taking a nap on your drive home after a hard day at work, or other things like watching videos with your family on the long drive to grandma's house. Now, some of the other benefits might be larger scale for society. Things like decreased pollution, increased energy savings, and better land use for reductions in parking spaces. And then, of course, one of the most important benefits could be in terms of saving lives. So the estimate is that there are about a little over 37,000 deaths last year in the US from automobile accidents. And autonomous vehicles have the potential to greatly reduce that. But as I rode in that autonomous vehicle, I also realized that consumers might well have privacy and security concerns. And the data bears that out. So there was a couple surveys recently. One surveyed consumers, asking them if they'd ever ride in a fully autonomous vehicle. And about 55% of consumers said no, that they wouldn't. They were worried about the technology and its reliability and safety. Another survey asked consumers if they would buy a fully autonomous vehicle. And about the same percentage, 55%, said no, they would never buy a fully autonomous vehicle. They just didn't trust the technology. They had concerns about it, despite the fact that, as we've all heard, there can be great safety gains. Now, just imagine a couple situations with me. So you're on a long car trip, and you're starting to get sleepy. And so your car suggests to you, why don't you pull over at the upcoming outlet of your favorite coffee shop? You think, well, isn't that a great invention? Isn't that a great idea? Safety, it's convenient, tells you where to go. But what if your car knew that it was your favorite coffee shop, by listening in on conversations in the car or by reading your email. Now, another example comes from the world of insurance. So your car is collecting information about how fast you're driving, are you using your turn signals, or you're talking on the phone a lot. And imagine it's sharing that information with your car insurance company. And that may be a good thing. You may say, okay, that's going to save me money. My rates might be lower because I'm a safe driver. But wouldn't you want to know that the car was sharing that information with the insurance company? So the question for a government regulator and enforcer like myself is, how do we address these kinds of concerns while still allowing connected cars to reach their full potential? So there's a few options that we could pursue. Now, the first one would be to do nothing. Just leave things as they are, to continue down the road of having regulation or enforcement that looks at a driver separate from an automobile. But I don't think that's very realistic. Cars have become essentially computers on wheels. They're doing great things, but they're collecting a lot of information, and we're relying on them more and more. Now, the other approach would be what I might call the Model T assembly line approach, which is adopting a one-size-fits-all approach that tries to predict all the things that might happen and come out with a single solution for that. But my experience with that has been that these things get bogged down in a lot of red tape, and they're not very flexible, and they ultimately don't serve society very well. So an example that comes to mind is trying to use existing taxi regulations to regulate car-sharing services like Uber and Lyft and other ones. That model, that old taxi model, didn't fit very well in the regulation of these new car ride-sharing services. And that's something I've seen a lot of at the FTC over the years, where you have a new innovator come into a market and the old regulations are a poor fit. And that's one of the reasons I've created an economic liberty task force at the FTC to work with state and federal regulators to try to adjust regulations and get these kind of barriers out of the way for new technologies. Now, a different approach from the one-size-fits-all is what I would call the custom car approach. And I think the FTC model represents this kind of approach. So the FTC, I'll give you a little background on it. I'm currently the chairman there. So the FTC is a bipartisan agency. We have Republicans and we have Democrats. And our mission, we have a dual mission, is to protect competition, is to promote competition and to protect consumers. And we do this in a variety of ways. But the basis for this is the FTC Act, which requires companies to operate honestly in the marketplace and to avoid inflicting substantial injury on consumers. And we've had a history of success in enforcing this kind of regulation and preventing deception and preventing unfair harm while still trying to allow innovation to develop and new products to come into the market without having to predict exactly what those new products are and how they will work. So to give you some examples, in the car area, we have brought enforcement actions against a number of car companies, a number of things in the automobile industry. So going back to the 1970s, we brought an enforcement action against Buick for not telling consumers that some of the cars they were selling were used. Now, more recently, we had a very big case you may have heard about against VW. We alleged that they had made misrepresentations about the emissions, the harmful emissions from their diesel vehicles. And we entered into a rather large settlement with VW, requiring them to be honest about what their emissions were, but also providing $14 billion in fines and redress to consumers. So there are three different ways that the FTC can carry out this role of trying to protect consumers while allowing innovation to flourish. The first role that we can play is educating the public. And the public includes business. So we have a wealth of information for businesses, giving them advice and guidance on how to protect consumers' privacy and safeguard their sensitive data. So we offer this to businesses, give them ideas, give them suggestions about being honest with consumers, about how they're using their data. We give them advice on how to secure that data, have strong passwords, have firewalls, have a process in place. We also provide guidance to consumers, and an automotive example comes to mind that we did recently, where consumers were connecting their devices in rental cars to the infotainment system. And we put out some consumer education informing them that they should be aware of the fact that that infotainment system might be collecting their sensitive data, their personal data. And they should think twice about whether they wanted to connect to that. And if they did decide to connect to it, to be sure that they erased that data before they returned the car. Now, a second activity that the FTC can do, and we do a lot of this, is enforcing the FTC Act. We can take action when a company crosses the double yellow line by doing something deceptive or unfair that causes substantial injury to consumers. Recently, we brought an enforcement action against Uber. Now, you may recall that there was quite a lot of hubbub in the press a few years ago when an Uber executive told a reporter that Uber could follow where that reporter had traveled by looking at that reporter's travel records in Uber. And so obviously this caused a big uproar, and Uber admitted that it was using this tool called GodView to follow the movements of certain people. So Uber then promised that it would not allow employees unfettered access to rider data or driver data, and it would only allow access for legitimate purposes. Well, we came to find out that Uber wasn't fulfilling that promise. And so we brought an action against them earlier this year, and Uber settled it with us. And they had a promise not to make misrepresentations about their privacy and data security. But more importantly, Uber also had to implement a comprehensive privacy program with outside audits. And as part of the settlement with the FTC, Uber has to apply that privacy program and those audits to connected cars as it moves into that space. Then the final tool that the FTC can use is to encourage self-regulation. Industry tends to be on the forefront of these issues and be very aware of what problems may arise, what their products that we don't even yet know about, what's coming down the road, and how that may impact consumers. And so the FTC has encouraged industry self-regulation in this space. I'm glad to see that the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers and the Global Manufacturers Association have adopted privacy principles about how their connected cars will collect and use consumer information. And we've encouraged other members of the industry to follow these principles. Cybersecurity is also an issue, and we've encouraged the auto industry to share things like threat signatures and alerts and other kinds of information that could impact cybersecurity for cars. And they've created an auto ISAC to share these kinds of information. I believe that the FTC's custom car approach can help get us to the right place with autonomous vehicles, encouraging companies to obey the rules of the road, to protect consumers' privacy and data security so that consumers feel more comfortable with this technology. And if we get it right, I'm very excited about what the future holds for people like my mother and all of us in our everyday lives. And I'm very excited about the benefits that will come to myself, my children, my grandchildren, and all of you here as we move down the road towards the innovation in driving. Thank you.